One of my favorite Czech Nymphs. I'm going to start out with the hook. It's a Hanik. If you can't get these hooks, your typical grub hooks will work fine for this too. Tiemco makes hooks for this sort of style too again, but this is the Hanik, the 300 BL. It's a Czech Nymph hook, but you can tell by the design of it again, it's got a really long spear, as do most of the Hanik hooks. Again, if you've never seen them, check them out or come take a look at mine during the break or afterwards. But they're excellent hookers and holders. You can see the length of the spear of the hook itself here. Very long, very sharp, and again, they're great holders. Now for the hook itself, I'm just going to use to match it up appropriately an 1/8 inch tungsten bead. And again, nothing super fancy, just your typical Superfly or whatever brand you have. Canadian Llama ones, I find, as I said earlier with my scale, I can actually measure and compare different weights. And Canadian Llama is actually one of the better ones. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but they've been very kind to me. But I must say that their bead, the quality in the last while has really come up. And very accurate as far as their sizes when I gauge them, which is important as competitive anglers. Plus, the other benefit with their ones is that they actually tend to be a little heavier than some. Depending on the composition of the bead itself, some of them really aren't as heavy as what you would imagine, but when you actually start measuring them on a scale, again, to be accurate, measure them in bigger quantities, not just one at a time. Take about 50 at a time and actually get a more accurate idea of what they're weighing in at. So what I'm going to use for the weight for this system is I've got the tungsten bead. You can use lead wire, or else my preferred method is lead sheeting. With this material, if you buy it, I think Dragonfly sells it. If you guys have seen this before, I imagine. Works excellent for nymphs in the sense it allows you to put weight on but also keep and maintain a slender body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this with a very sharp piece or pair of scissors. I'm just going to cut a piece on that's about maybe a little under 1/8 inch in thickness. So once you're finished cutting, you can see it's a nice thin strip. The advantage of this over lead is that it allows you to actually build a better taper on the body. And also it allows you to keep it a little bit thinner, so you're not going to have that real thick profile. And the key is with these patterns, if it's too bulky and too thick, it's going to have more resistance and it'll sink slower. I've tied different patterns up just to get an idea how they sink. And again, I find that the same pattern tied with the same beads, maybe a little bit different on the weight, but not a lot in my mind. But being a bit thinner, it actually does help the descent rate. So I'm going to attach the tape to the back. The nice thing about the sticky type lead tape is that, again, as you can see, you can just stick it on, it'll stay in place. It's a lot easier to work with. So I'm going to start this sort of towards the deep part of the bend of the hook. I'm just going to secure it and wrap it forward. And the key with this is I'm going to have it so each wrap is touching but not overlapping the preceding wrap. Bring it up to the bead. You're going to have to double it over, and then I'm going to work it back down towards the bend again. And I'm not going to bring it all the way down. I'm going to bring it about a little over 2/3 of the way back, and then I'm going to bend it back up forward again, wrapping it over. And again, it's giving it a lot of weight between the tungsten and the lead, and just working it over and folding it. As a general reference, what I typically do if I'm at home and I'm trying to, when you buy this, it comes on a long sheet. I'll typically pre-cut it. For reference, very typical, I'll just take a typical bead bag or any sort of Ziploc bag you have, and I'll cut them to almost the length of the bag, pre-cut them, and then actually cut them into little strips and leave them in, so it's a lot quicker. It's like anything with your fly tying. If it's set up and you're ready to go, it's going to be a quicker process than doing the little tedious steps in between. So now I have the lead all on here. You can see how nice it stays in place too. It doesn't roll around like lead wire can. It actually is stuck to here in a sense, but it's not going to stay permanently. So the next thing I'm going to do is secure this down with the fly tying thread. I'll start at the bead, and for this I like to put a few wraps at the bead to sort of lock it down so it's not going to spin around and move. And then I'm just going to hold the excess tag end of the thread over the back of the lead. What this does, same thing with if you're working with lead wire, it helps it so that the tying thread doesn't necessarily fall into the cracks between them and get buried. So again, I'm going to just bring this back all the way down to the end of the lead wraps and just cut this off, or you can tear it if you like. And for this pattern, I'm just going to bring it a little bit further down here and kind of build a bit of a taper up to the lead, because as you put the lead on, you're going to notice there's going to be a bit of a step down. So this will kind of give it a bit more of that tapered look. Next step, what I want to do is for my shell back on this, to try and give it, again, that ability to sink faster. The slickness or smoothness of this is going to allow it to sink. This pattern will sink with a hook upwards, the point upwards. So again, this is what I'm going to use. You can use all sorts of different materials. Actually, I'm going to use a different one here for this, but one of the materials that I've used, and I buy this whenever I go to Europe, it's made by Klima Products. Yuri Klima, the sort of renowned master of Czech nymphing when it came out. Oliver Edwards dubbed him the river god when he saw how proficient he was at that technique. But he markets and sells this. It's called a Spectra strip. Nice thing about this, and I haven't really seen anything that really compares in my mind in North America, but it's kind of a braided, I'm trying to get it in the light here, it's kind of a braided a shell backing, so it really catches the light at different angles, so it actually is a little more attractive and visible in the water in my mind. So I'm just going to hold it on the back, and the same thing as my other materials that I find hard to get. I'm going to work with it off of the I'm going to work with it off of the package. I'm not going to actually trim it. This is one of those materials that I don't want to waste a single strand of it. So again, having the benefit of a rotary vise allows me to do this. So I'm just going to clip this up here in the spring holder. And then for the ribbing, you can use a variety of different types of rib for this pattern. The one that I use, and again, unfortunately, you're not going to find this one in the stores anywhere at this time, but you can use just regular round rib. But this one here is actually, if you can see this, sorry, I'm trying to orient it here for that, but it's actually a flat copper ribbing. The benefit of this one is that, for one thing, it keeps a more slender body, less resistance when it sinks, and also when I'm working with dubbing, it tends to make the dubbing stand out straight. It doesn't tilt it or angle it. So when I comb out or rake out the dubbing with my little dubbing pick or rasp, it allows it to come more square out. So again, it just has a bit better look in my mind. This one here, I'm just going to break off a little piece of it and secure it. But again, just going with the theme of using flat lead tape on this flat lead wire gives a real nice effect on it. So I'm just going to wrap this on and secure this, and then bring my my thread back down here. Now for the body material on this pattern, you can use a variety of different materials. You're not really bound to using one set material. One of the materials that I use a lot of for some of my nymphs is just plain glow bug yarn. The reason I use this, if you compare this to a lot of the dubbing materials, it tends to, when I tie it into the pattern, which I'll demonstrate on another one, it tends to catch in the teeth of the fish for a split second. This was something I learned as a steelheader back in the days when I used roe and spoons and wool and everything else. It's known by steelheaders that using wool with your presentation, especially with eggs, when the fish grabs it, say your roe bag or whatever you're using, they can grab it and spit it. But sometimes having that little bit of yarn will get caught in the sharp teeth for a split second, so it allows you that extra fraction of a second to set the hook. In the case of nymphing, as I said, the fish will grab and spit your hook just in a split second before you can even ask yourself if that was a fish. That's too late. So this kind of gives a slight delay in the sense that it's going to allow you to have a bit more of a time to react to it. So what I'm going to do is just nothing fancy with it. You can buy dubbing if you want, but this will last you and probably a dozen of your buddies a lifetime again, and it's very cheap to buy it this way. I paid $1.69 for this, and that was a couple of years ago. And you can see how much I still have left. So all you have to do really is just pull off some fibers. There's no exact science to it, but what I like to do with this is basically roll it and wrap it around the thread. You don't have to use dubbing wax, in this case just to get it locked on, and then just roll it a bit more firm on here. And then I'm going to actually just wrap it forward on the body. And again, you can see I'm not really building a real thick fat taper like you would for a lot of nymphs that most people would end up having a very bulky thick body. But this here, just a small amount, is going to give me the orange that I want to see on this pattern. And again, if you're not using orange as a color when you're fishing for trout, browns or rainbows, you've got to give it a try because they actually go crazy for this pattern. When I fished it at times where I've had other color ones just to experiment with it, this one will outfish them almost every time. So then just get rid of the excess and then throw a half hitch on the fly just there again behind the bead. And then I'm just going to pull my shell back material over the top. Oh, sorry, just one step before I do that. At this point, I'm just going to put, just make a slight little dubbing loop here and grab my dubbing wax for this. You can use all sorts of different materials to sort of imitate the thorax or legs on it. With this pattern, I just find just using just plain old hare's ear. This one here, again, it's tough to find good materials in my mind for certain things, especially when you're getting down to smaller flies. This one here is just natural. They call it fox squirrel. One thing I recommend is if you're going to buy it, open up the packages and pinch a little amount off. Take it out and get a look at it, because a lot of them have so much filler and fluff in them that really the guard hairs is what you're trying to get. They really don't show up. In this case, what I'll do is I'll actually sit with these and grab a little clump of them and grab a second clump, get a white piece of paper, and I'll actually rub them together. I don't know if you can see that, or maybe I can. Can you just turn the camera down for a second here? Even the best quality ones that I buy, I'm still not really happy with them, because the idea is I want to have more guard hair than I want fluff when I'm going to try and tie the thorax. So I'll just take, just on the paper down here, if you could shoot right where my finger is. Right over there. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll grab 2 clumps of the material, and I'll just take and rub them together, and you can see how the guard hairs all fall out of it. What I'll do is I'll sit down and actually take a whole package and I'll shake through it all while my wife is watching The Bachelor or something. Not that I watch or like the show, but it is pretty interesting. But anyway, so I'll sit there and I'll shake it all out and I'll throw all the fluff away, and I'll be left with a small condensed bag with nothing but the actual guard hairs in it. So again, it's a very effective way to make it, especially for small flies where you don't want a lot of bulk. So again, I'm not going to rely on the fact that I'm going to have a ton of this. So I'm just going to wet my finger, bring them up here, and just try to rub them off on this dubbing wax again, and just bring some more up. And again, it's going to achieve a far better effect than having all that fluff in it. And just spin it or hang it down and spin it. In this case, I'm not going to move my vise over the edge and spin it. But just get it locked in there, and by doing your dubbing loop, you're going to end up having a really nice, secure strand of this that's not going to fall apart on you. Now, with this, I'm going to just hang my bobbin off the rest there, and I'm just going to wrap this over and just keep wrapping this. But you can see the effect, rather than having all that bulk that you have, and that's quite often a big problem for a lot of tires, it's going to allow it to have a real buggy, leggy look, and you're not going to have that extra bulk. So I'm going to take it to this point here. I'm just going to bring it down, and I'm going to do the same trick. I'm going to wrap my thread around it because I do not want this to come undone. Bring this over the top, and then lock it down and then trim it off. But whenever you're working with these dubbing loops, you know, throwing a half hitch in here or there too, it's a really wise thing to do, because there's nothing worse than all that time you spent to get it on there and then all of a sudden it comes undone on you. So I'm going to pull the shell back over the top. Now before I do that, I'm just going to sort of comb some of these back and force them back here. And I'm just going to lock that down and pull that over the top. The nice thing with this braided material compared to smooth shell backing, the braids in it kind of help it to stay better in place. It doesn't tend to come undone as much just because of the little fibers or strands, the way they're set up. So again, I'm going to throw a half hitch in here. And just make sure that's nice and cinched down behind that bead. Hang this over to the side. And again, the feature of the rotary, I can bring it forward, but first I want to make sure my flat wire is not bent or crimped over. And I'm just going to bring it over, watching out for that hook. And nice thing with the rotary too, compared to tying with just a stationary vise, is it allows you to see all sides, so you know if your ribbing is actually looking equal throughout the whole pattern itself. And then I'm just going to keep bringing this forward, and again, not trying to crush any of these guard hairs. And when I get to this point here, not that it's really going to matter to the fish, I don't want to crush the guard hairs, but I'm going to bring it forward and wrap it around the eye here. And it's also going to force some of those guard hairs back. Now for this pattern, the nice thing about it too is the fact that you're using the steelhead wool. You don't have to worry about counter wrapping because it's not going to sink into that wool. So I've got it locked down here, and again I'm going to wrap it around this just so I'm going to lock that down and it's not going to come undone. And then just trim off the excess and just maybe just tidy up the head to get the braided fibers off. Put a little half hitch here, and there's not a whole lot of room back here, so I want to make sure that this knot's not going to come undone. I'm going to put a little bit of varnish or nail polish again that I pick up with my daughter when she goes into Claire's and all these other little girly shops.
So you can substitute nail polish for super glue?
Yeah, in the case of this here, I just don't want to have super glue getting on the guard hairs and affecting that. And again, always pull, wiggle it back and forth, and you'd be surprised if you actually look under a magnifier how much your knot shifts and moves as you do these tugs. So again, it's better to pull it now, lock it down, than have it come undone when you're actually fishing. What you can do too with this one here is a pearl shellback material on it. If you ever are going to order it, again, as a club, you guys have the benefit of bulk buys, but one I use for different colors is actually a brown. If you do buy it, the perfect size in my mind for the average nymph is size 4. If you're going to tie smaller nymphs with a shellback, 3 is perfect, but tying on size 8s and 10s, size 4, what he sells, is perfect. 5 is better when you're tying more on the bigger size patterns. So again, unfortunately the light doesn't really do it justice. I mean, you can't really see the orange quite so much. But you can see underneath though, when you look at it, just with the flat ribbing, in the case of a pattern like this, it looks a little more natural. It'll break up the segmentation even on the back of it. It looks more like the natural. This pattern too, with the color choices I made on this one here, you can find this actually, it's been in a few books too, that's called Todd's Czech Nymph.